All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Jacob Mchangama, who is the executive director of the Future of Free Speech Project and a research professor at Vanderbilt University, as well as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Additionally, in the past, Jacob has written extensively on free speech and human rights for many international media outlets and is the author of the book Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. So, Jacob, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Ben.
So when did you first get interested in free speech?
So I think what really piqued my interest was when a Danish newspaper, I was born and raised in Denmark and just recently moved to the US. But a Danish newspaper published a number of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, which at least among some Muslims is taboo. And Denmark is a very secular, liberal country where everyone took free speech for granted, especially when it comes to poking fun at religion. But suddenly, Denmark became sort of the epicenter of a global battle of values over the relationship between free speech and religion, and it created some major fault lines even within Danish society about whether these cartoons were an abuse of free speech used to punch down on a minority, or whether they were sort of just a part of a tradition of being able to be irreverent and poke fun at both religious and political authorities that had been long established in Denmark. But it was also a global conflict that led to death and destruction around the world, and is still with us. It was basically because the French magazine Charlie Hebdo, as one of few magazines, republished the cartoons as an act of solidarity, that they um, were targeted by a deathly attack back in 2015, and sort of this issue still um, flares up now and again. So that's really what got me started to think about free speech more.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you grew up in a kind of an interesting environment then in Europe that, many Americans sort of have a different battle with free speech, I suppose. But yeah, with Europe and sort of some Muslim immigrants that have come to Europe through that, huge migration over the last decade, and how society responds to this combination and mixing of cultures and beliefs, um,
Yeah,
always kind of puts free speech into an interesting situation. So
yeah, definitely. And interestingly, it was mostly from the left that these cartoons were sort of seen as overstepping the bounds of free speech and stepping into the territory of racism or bigotry. Um, but then, a center-right government came into power that passed certain laws that were thinly veiled attempts to limit the religious speech of Muslims, sort of imams and others, and then suddenly people on the right who had defended free speech during the cartoon crisis thought that that was okay, and people on the left who had been apprehensive about free speech during the cartoon uh, crisis were suddenly saying, "Oh, this is going too far." So that sort of shows how positions tend to shift according to ideological um, preferences, and that is something that I think most people that follow free speech debate in the U.S. Are very familiar with.
yeah.
Even though the fault line here is the fault lines are different. It's not about typically about depicting um, the Muslim the Prophet Muhammad, though that has popped up again. It's more sort of
Sure.
along partisan lines that this conflict is manifests itself here in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of created in terms of, we were talking about the left and the Muslim community sort of getting upset about how things were depicted in Islam when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad. It always kind of struck me as kind of an odd grouping because I feel like Muslims in many ways would have more conservative values overall. So being on the left on that issue always kind of struck me as kind of funny almost, since it's a kind of a strange combination to a certain extent, I suppose. Um,
Yeah, you could say that a lot of Muslim immigrants have values that are on social issues that would
Yes.
align better with sort of traditional conservative values. However, it is also true that many conservatives in Europe harbor strong feelings about Islam and not necessarily
Mm.
very positive ones, and want
Yep.
to limit Muslim immigration. So in that sense, even though they might sort of be in agreement on sort of the importance of family, sort of attach more importance to groups over individuals and so on. The alignment has not really been made. So, but it's true that and it's odd that people on the left would sort of rally to the defense of people who insist that religious taboos um, should prohibit people from expressing their views, which is not particularly emancipatory.
Yeah.
Um, so strange bedfellows sometimes in these free speech debates.
Yeah, it is. You get kind of unique groupings depending on what's going on. So now, in your book, you're doing this sort of big picture look at the history of free speech, which is super interesting and cool. I know like throughout history, people kind of generally know about free speech history, perhaps like ancient Greece, or people will think in the modern era of like, oh, there's the First Amendment, the U.S. Constitution. But what are some places where free speech has been protected that most are not aware of historically?
Yeah, well, the history of free speech sort of ebbs and flows. So I would say that some of those, well, if you want to start with the beginning, I would say that the Athenian democracy is probably where free speech has its roots, even though the concepts at the time differ somewhat from ours. The Athenian democracy, some 2,500 years ago, was a direct democracy, um, where people would, at least theoretically, every freeborn male citizen would have a direct vote and could also discuss the topics of the day and the laws proposed. So that was isagoria, meaning equality of speech, which was sort of political free speech. But then they also had the concept of parousia, meaning uninhibited speech, which is a broader cultural phenomenon, an attachment to social dissent, which would allow Athenians to discuss all kinds of things in philosophy and so on. There were limits, as Socrates would find out, but it was sort of a cultural trait of Athens, which I think is crucial to the history of free speech. But then you find, maybe too many in the West, you find very important developments in medieval Islam, for instance, that you would not call it free speech, but sort of freedom of inquiry becomes very important. You have some of the earliest medieval radical free thinkers you find in and around the Abbasid Caliphate, for instance,
Yep.
people who directly question, prophecy and holy books, and who sort of offer much more radical ideas um, than you find anyone daring to do in the West. And of course, you also have this translation movement in the Abbasid Caliphate, where a lot of Greek ancient works on science and philosophy are translated, and they contribute to sort of the retransmission of Greek ideas into the Latin West, where they then become institutionalized when you have um, the establishment of universities and so on. And I would say that even of, often a lot of people will think of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, but there was surprisingly open atmosphere, at least among sort of a small elite of learned scholars who were willing to sort of push the permissible limits of thought. Even though they saw themselves as pious Christians, they challenged a lot of ideas, and sort of the idea of disputing was very much alive at universities and contributes to what would later become sort of academic freedom and freedom of expression.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, seems like there's always someone carrying the torch in history, but it's hard. It's not necessarily really popular or common. So, um,
No, I mean, every time someone is seen as a heretic or a radical, very often they're the ones who sort of stood up for ideas that today we take for granted and that we
yeah,
cherish as cornerstones of society we live in today.
yeah, definitely. It's pretty interesting. So, I mean, thinking of the world today, then on the global level, do you think free speech is increasing or is it decreasing? What's your take on how things are developing today across the world?
Yeah, so if you looked at the quantitatively, you would say that there's probably never been more speech in the world than right now, due to technological developments, the digital sphere, where 5 billion people are on the internet, almost as many are on the social media. You can use AI to create synthetic speech, speech for you that can amplify it, and at your fingertips you have access to most of the knowledge in the world that even the you know would be unprecedented even 15 or 20 or 30 years ago. Imagine what Aristotle could have thought up if he had access to all the knowledge that you and I can access with a Google search right now.
Yeah.
He would probably have changed several of his ideas. But even though the the quantity of speech is probably unprecedented and grows exponentially, I would say that the parameters of free speech have actually been narrowed. So there's an increasing tendency for more than a decade, for governments to limit free speech. This includes open democracies, by the way. So I actually think that even though we might be, living in a golden age of free speech compared to previous ages, this golden age is in decline, and free speech is very often seen as a threat and to um, even to democratic values like tolerance and equality, even to truth. And of course, authoritarian states who are resurgent view free speech as a mortal enemy. You cannot be an authoritarian ruler, whether it's in Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and permit political pluralism. So it's sort of page one on the dictator's playbook that you want to limit free speech. And unfortunately, many thought that in the digital age, um, traditional censorship would be sort of consigned to the ash heap of history, because the internet, social media would basically make censorship impossible. But I think a lot of authoritarian states have proved that you can also use um, technology to impose large scale surveillance and censorship. Um, so I think we're at a critical moment right now, and unfortunately, a lot of people, intelligent people, influential pundits, even in traditional media who cannot thrive without free speech, press freedom, have come to view free speech in the digital age as something that maybe has gone too far, that needs to be reined in, and that it's a recurrent phenomenon throughout history. It's what I call elite panics, where the traditional gatekeepers of the public sphere tend to fear the consequences when the public sphere is expanded through um, disruptive communications technology or the expansion to new voices that were previously marginalized, whether it's racial, religious minorities, women, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that makes complete sense. Obviously, when you think of, historically, like, oh, the printing press and how that changed things, and obviously today with the internet and social media, the world of free speech has drastically changed, and how people react to that, and how society's response to that is something that I guess people are constantly trying to figure out while maintaining democratic values, or if you're an authoritarian, how to prevent that from allowing any type of free speech, and sort of taking control over your internet and your society. So, what do you think have been the big benefits for free speech when it comes to the internet, and what have been the downsides then?
Yeah. So I think we tend to take the benefits for granted. We don't, the fact that you can, you know, potentially at least sort of directly criticize powerful leaders, or that an ordinary person who would never be let into a newsroom or be given a microphone by editors can actually express themselves in the public sphere. We tend to take that for granted, even though it was not possible 15 years ago. Um, and then I think we have this myopic tendency to focus on the dark sides. And of course, when you provide basically every single person in the world potentially um, the ability to express themselves in real time across borders, and with no sort of um, prior censorship, that will allow a lot of speech that is hurtful, offensive to various people, and sometimes even harmful. So, it's certainly true that speech can contribute to real life violence and atrocities, and so on. So that's the downsides. But I think that we have a tendency to focus a lot on the dark sides, and take the benefits for granted, and not really think of it as exercising free speech when we communicate the way that we do, even though and this is mostly in open democracies, a lot of people in open democracies write things every day that would put them in jail in many other countries, but
Yeah,
they don't think of it as exercising free speech because it's just, your average day on Twitter.
yeah, they take it for granted. That's for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I think that most Americans would be in prison by now, and some of the real authoritarian countries of the world. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. For
So,
sure.
um, now, so when it comes to things like social media, then, if you're in charge of a social media company, or if you're just thinking about in general, social media companies, how do you balance free speech while not letting like your platform become this sort of overly toxic waste dump where you got maybe bots manipulating algorithms,
Yeah.
and or extremists promoting content, or you have foreign disinformation campaigns. How do you protect that space as much as you can while also protecting free speech?
Yeah. I guess that depends on whether you're in it for the money and scale and shareholders, or whether you're sort of very principled free speech absolutist of the old school techno optimistic
Yeah.
kind, in sort of in the 90s when the World Wide Web exploded, sort of John Perry Barlow's
uh,
Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. I think if you know, I think a lot of the platforms that grew big initially were sort of infused with the techno optimistic spirit where free speech would just be allowed to reign with very, very few limits. And I think they found out really quickly that that is not feasible when you suddenly become a huge platform with a lot of people with very different ideas on where to draw the line, when you have advertisers who expect a certain tone and don't want to be associated with different views. And especially when governments suddenly find out that you can have an influence and you maybe become an important player in the public sphere, they'll have ideas about what kind of content should be there. And then when you find out that hostile governments can try to manipulate your platform. So I think that the tendency towards more and more bigger, larger, centralized platforms almost inevitably means a movement towards more aggressive content moderation, less speech protective terms of service, community guidelines. I think that there are things you could do for centralized platforms. I think you could allow sort of more distributed content moderation where users get to have a more say over what content they're being confronted with rather than this push towards centralization.
Yeah.
You can also try to use sort of robust international human rights standards, but it sounds a lot easier than it is when you moderate at scale, where you have to make millions of decisions every minute, which inevitably will have to be automized, and so there'll be algorithmic content moderation, which is not very good at context and so on.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned, like distributed content moderation, I think is one way forward. Another more radical way would be, for users to sort of say, okay, we've had it with these big platforms. Let's go back to sort of the days of the blogosphere, sort of an updated version of the blogosphere where you don't have these huge mega platforms. But then on the other hand, human beings are not, the ease of having these platforms where everyone is on, where it's sort of plug and play, I
Yeah.
think is just attractive to a lot of people who might, and a lot of people just they use Facebook to connect with friends and so on. It's not that they're necessarily hyper invested in free speech issues, and so why would you go to the trouble of switching to a much smaller platform that don't have all the ease of use that a Facebook or Instagram has.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting because I remember just thinking about when I was a kid and the internet was really starting to come about. And I remember like the Windows 98 days and then eventually like MySpace came out. I remember years later and yeah, I mean social media networks were literally just for friends, just keep in touch, posting some random pictures or something like that. And with sort of the influx of it becoming kind of like a hub for news stories and stuff, it's really changed the game in terms of why people go on social media. I feel
Yeah.
like many people now get only their news from social media instead of going to individual websites, or of course the old days when you're getting a newspaper or a subscription magazine in the mail. So it's really changed a lot. You almost wonder if social media companies, by incorporating news so much, have almost done themselves a disservice because now they're dealing with all these issues they probably didn't expect, and kind of opened up Pandora's box there. Because I guess the fear is always, when it comes to free speech and content moderation, is how to avoid government trying to regulate you, if they feel like there's a national security problem, or how to avoid lawsuits. If someone does some mass shooting because they got, brainwashed
Yeah.
on your social media service, then the families sue you for it. It
Yeah, and,
seems
and
like
those
it's
cases are as of
yeah,
going through the court system here in the U.S. with families sort of victims of ISIS attacks, I believe, sort of trying to hold Google, for instance, accountable
yeah,
because ISIS was able to spread videos, I think, on YouTube. Um, but the U.S. has, with the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, has built a pretty strong shield. I mean, it's up in the air how it will be interpreted going forward. But that has, I think without that provision, which generally um, immunizes, for instance, social media companies from user-generated content, I don't think we would have seen the growth of social media. Just because if you risk being held liable for every defamatory comment made
Mm-hmm.
by users,
Yeah.
or then you probably wouldn't allow user-generated comment, which is and content, which is the whole idea of social media, right?
Yeah.
It depends on the content generated by users. Most of the content is not generated by the platforms themselves. And as I said, that is also like inevitably will give rise to a lot of content that a lot of people find disturbing or don't want to be confronted with. And then when you reach a certain size, you want to make sure that users stay on your platform, that they don't switch away. So, are you going to bat for the neo Nazis out of
Yeah.
your principles to free speech, or are you going to accommodate the vast majority of users who may not want to be confronted with Nazis?
Yeah.
Once you become a publicly traded company, that's a pretty easy decision for most, right?
Sure. You would hope. Yeah.
So in that way, you also become incentivized, I think, to root out certain forms of speech, and a lot of that, especially in the U.S., would be perfectly lawful legal speech that would be protected under the First Amendment.
Right.
Um, the and of course the another inevitable consequence of that is once you start moderating at scale, you will remove, there'll be collateral damage. So almost inevitably, it'll be sort of over removal, at least from a free speech perspective. So a lot of comments that your hate that will sort of be lumped in with your prohibition against hate speech or whatever, and be removed, even though when looked in isolation, most people would say that that's not really what we had in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess with like the over removal process, I could definitely see how that could lead to, as we already seen to a certain extent, I guess, new platforms kind of popping up for those people that feel alienated on platforms, which may lead to better or worse social media platforms. I know. But yeah, it's interesting dynamic to see play out in real time. Um, what would you say then is the biggest concern about free speech today for you?
Yeah, so I think the biggest concern for me is that democratic governments and a lot of people in democracies seem to have lost some faith in free speech. It's not that they want to discard free speech as such, but I think a lot of people want to sort of see free speech be given less emphasis and be sort of balanced more against other interests, and sort of say, oh, um, maybe, maybe we need stronger laws against hate speech or disinformation or whatever it is. I think that is a dangerous process. I think it's a cure worse than the disease very often, and I think it also helps erode the culture of free speech, which is essential for free speech to flourish. Um, so I think that's a huge danger. And once democracies give up on free speech, I think then the game is over, because if open societies that where free speech is, you know part of the very DNA of those societies, if they give up and don't push this agenda, don't go to bat for it globally, then no one will. And then, it will also help legitimize the crackdowns in authoritarian states, which we've already seen several worrying examples of. So that's my big worry.
Yeah. I mean, the subjective nature of hate speech, especially, and government regulation of it is a really scary thing that kind of, I think, becomes a ticking time bomb over time, because it's, you can, easily just determine, anything could be hate speech, if you want to be. And I mean, we see authoritarian governments do this all the time. If you go to, in Russia, I mean, almost everything, anything that you possibly say that's negative about the government in Russia today, or the Russian army today, especially, hate speech, you're in prison. That's so it's definitely scary to see that. I guess in Europe, they've actually become a little aggressive about hate speech, over the years. So it's kind of disturbing.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And it's not a new phenomenon. So, for instance, after World War II, when the United Nations was to adopt its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and later the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, these global human rights treaties, the very question of where to draw the line on free speech was something that divided the democracies and authoritarian states along sort of Cold War lines. So the U.S. had a very um, um, strong position, saying basically that international human rights law should only protect free speech, so there should not be any explicit limitations. Whereas the Soviet Union said not only should governments be allowed to free restrict free speech when it comes to hate speech, there should be an obligation to do so. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the U.S. delegate and the chair of the Commission on Human Rights, made some very eloquent speeches, which also I think turned out to be prophetic about the dangers of permitting governments um, to rely on human rights to restrict free speech, because that obviously became a tactic within the Soviet Union, and even in today's Russia, you see that laws against hate speech and extremism is used to punish dissidents, and so on. And I think in this country at this very polarized moment, I think if you opened up, if the First Amendment was to say, well, you know what, um, we will allow you to adopt these viewpoint content based restrictions on free speech to safeguard other worthy goals like equality and tolerance, I think you would see that different states would adopt very different hate speech laws
Yeah.
targeting very different people. So you would have one type of hate speech law in New York and California that sort of aligned with the prevalent political orthodoxy in those states, and then
Yeah.
you go to Tennessee and Alabama and current Florida, and these laws would be weaponized against very other different groups. So I think that would be a very very unhealthy development in this country.
Yeah. I mean, in a very polarized country, the idea of allowing these political parties to regulate speech is just a disaster. Oh my gosh, that would be so bad. Yeah. Um, because I mean, I think, yeah, we do have right now in the country many politicians that would happily do that too. That's the
Yeah, and
scary
you're
part.
already seeing it. So here in Tennessee, there was a law against sort of bail against against drag shows in public that I think has been at least temporarily suspended on First Amendment grounds. Florida, you see a lot of laws limiting First Amendment rights. You see it in Texas with public libraries and so on. So that development has already begun, but the First Amendment has so far been sort of a huge impediment to many of these laws.
Yeah.
Um, um, and which I think is interesting because a lot of the backlash against free speech has come from sort of leftist groups who have lost faith a bit in the First Amendment, sort of seen it as being weaponized against the powerless and the marginalized, and suddenly you're seeing conservative states, Republican-dominated legislatures restrict free speech, and suddenly people start realizing, well, maybe the First Amendment is actually a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side of that is that conservatives have griped for a long time about how the left was stifling free speech, especially in universities and cultural institutions. And then suddenly, when they have solid political majorities, they have few qualms about using state power to limit free speech, which is pretty incompatible with the idea that private universities should respect free speech, but not states, not state governments. So in that sense, I think there are some pretty big blind spots in this country, unfortunately.
Yeah, for sure. That's it seems to be a lot of irony where everyone wants to care about free speech until they don't. And
Yeah, and I think it's a human thing.
yep,
Human beings are not, in the abstract, free speech appeals to a lot of people around the world, and especially in democracies where you know we can sort of we can articulate, we've been taught why free speech is good. But once you go from sort of the abstract theoretical um, value of free speech, and it becomes sort of emotional, and speech furthers ideas that clashes with your deepest held convictions, then you can sort of convince yourself that free speech does not really apply to that particular set of speech. And I think human beings are extremely good at that. Sort of
yes, yeah,
motivated reasoning for that, that sort of leads your biases to draw the lines, and sort of short circuit your reasoned, principled understanding of free speech.
yeah. That's so true. I mean, other examples that just pop in my mind just come from when you have all these different denominations of a religion, and they're like, oh, well, our denomination is the correct one. It's like, no,
Yeah.
no.
No, it goes. Martin Luther. He's
Yep,
summoned before the emperor of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he gives this great speech where he says, yes, I wrote these treatises, and unless you can convince me via scripture, I'm going to stand my ground. I don't think you should violate your conscience. And then he goes back, and then when other Protestants, reformers, sort of use Luther's appeal to read the Bible for yourself, and they come up with very different interpretations of what
yep,
truth is. He suddenly changes his mind, and ends up sort of advocating capital punishment for blasphemy, and atrocious anti-Semitic policies, and so on. And take in this country, the Puritans who arrived here, are
yep,
often described as coming in search of religious liberty, and that may be true, but that was religious liberty for themselves. Once they had established colonies, they certainly were not in favor, of religious liberty for anyone else. And you have
yeah,
draconian punishments, up to and including executions of people who thought the wrong way.
yeah. Not the most tolerant people at the end of the
No,
day.
I
Yeah,
think if you want to find sort of religious intolerance, Puritan New England was it's a pretty good pretty good place to find it in
yeah.
sort of in the 17th century.
I mean, I think it comes down to really just this. I think you were getting at this sort of human element about people where, certain ideals, whether it's free speech or religion, on paper are good and dandy, but at the end of the day, it's really about taking that and applying it to what you're comfortable believing. Because at the end of the day, it's what people personally believe, and then they will kind
Yeah,
of manipulate a text or something to fit that belief. Um,
absolutely.
you see that
It's
with the
the
Constitution all the time. So,
yeah, and it's what I think Jonathan Haidt calls sort of it's the elephant and the rider, where sort of our reason is the rider, but is sort of the elephant that sort of leads the way,
yep,
and then we come up with elaborate explanations of why that is actually right and true. But sort of it's our biases and our psych our complicated psychological makeup that actually decides a lot of these issues, and we're not very good at overriding our our tendencies towards tribalism and
Yep.
intolerance.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like we're pretty good at becoming tribalistic pretty fast.
Yeah, and I think that was probably a very good thing for us at a certain stage of human evolution. That you
Yeah.
that you want strong tribalism to be able to survive and stick together, and but in a complicated digital diverse society with people of very different ideas about the good society, hardcore tribalism becomes a threat to open societies, and open societies are difficult to maintain, I think.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
um, so I think I think some degree of tribalism is necessary. It's what I would call sort of benign tribalism. I think you need that to create social cohesion, to foster an identity that binds people together. But but once it tips over to more malign forms of tribalism, it becomes intolerant and in the worst forms genocidal.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
on every step of that ladder, from sort of intolerant to genocidal, of course, free speech will will suffer more and more.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's great to be part of a group, but if that group starts to encompass your life so much where you become blinded to anything outside of it,
Yeah,
then you're doing a disservice to yourself. So
yeah, but also, if you become convinced that the ideas and values that hold that group together are you know, is the capital T truth,
yeah,
and ideas that clash with it not only pollute it, but actually contribute to breaking down those values and mores, and that will cause the ruin of society and ultimately the individuals in it as well. Well, why wouldn't you want to suppress people with dangerous ideas? After
yeah,
all, what is true and good, and so I think a lot of people throughout history have suppressed free speech out of good intentions, because they actually truly believed that they were protecting ideas um, that conformed to truth, and they were suppressing ideas that would lead to moral and maybe even physical destruction of the society, maybe even the world that they lived in. And you, of course, this is especially prevalent with religion, because there was a time when most people would take it for granted that God could punish society if you allowed heretical, blasphemous ideas to spread, and so you would not only protect society as a whole, but also individuals from whose salvation would be threatened, if they were
yeah,
if the moral contagion of heretical ideas were allowed to spread. So you were doing something good.
yeah. I mean, that's a great point and really interesting about people in general because I think it's very easy to dehumanize people that become extremists, but in their heads they're completely rational, and many times they think of themselves as doing this rational, truthful act, um,
Sure.
and their beliefs are honest, and but it just goes to show that this idea of absolute truths in life is it can be very dangerous. It's better to
Yeah.
have just a tad bit of skepticism, even about things that you're sure must be true, but what's most likely to be true is very different than what you absolutely know to be true.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. And of course, there are, typically at the top of the pyramid, there will be these malignant leaders who might not necessarily who know that they're engaging in horrific crimes, and who might be motivated by a mix of genuine belief, but also just sort of the willingness um, to exercise power and maximize power.
Yeah.
But a lot of the sort of ordinary people, I think, will be motivated by ideals and say, well, we need to you know cut off the infected limbs, and the infected limbs are the people who hold wrong and dangerous ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty scary. Well, on that positive note, what gives you hope when it comes to free speech today?
Well, I think free speech is a very strong idea, and I think it has a lot of appeal. And I think that when people realize, when they suddenly feel the effects on their own bodies, or they see it sort of coming close to them, what what restrictions on free speech can lead to, I think that can sort of rally the troops, if you like. So I see a positive development now, for instance, on universities and college campuses, where I think a lot of university administrators and leaders have come to realize that the pendulum has swung too far, and that they need to sort of um, do more to stand up for academic freedom and open dialogue on universities. I also think that some of the laws that I mentioned in the Republican states, I think that, well, first of all, some of them might, and many of them might be struck down on First Amendment grounds. But if they, some of them are allowed to survive, I think you're likely to see that the results are will become well, that they will result in outcomes that can just not be justified by the way they affect ordinary people. And I think that
Sure.
will help um, uh, rally people sort of saying, well, we have to stand firm on on free speech. Um, and yeah, so those are sort of some of my hopes. Ultimately, of course, I think if a lot of people would delve into the history of free speech, they they might realize what a precious and counterintuitive idea that this is, and how much, even though it's an experiment and you can't guarantee positive outcomes, I think it has been absolutely essential to the societies that we inhabit, and that, at least in my uh, from my point of view, have created a lot of progress compared um, to what previous generations enjoyed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We just got to get more people to get your book then. So we get
Exactly.
give more people educated
Exactly.
about this history. That's crucial to their life. Um, so what are you currently working on then?
Yeah. So right now I am working on, well, a number of things. So we're looking at, for instance, when it comes to social media, we're looking at how hate speech policies have developed on social media platforms, 8 major social media platforms since they were first formulated and up until now. And that shows sort of a picture of scope creep on how these hate speech policies have generally been expanded more and more. We're working on a map, an interactive map of speech restrictive laws and policies in open democracies,
Hmm.
including the United States.
Wow.
We're working on these toolkits that will empower civil society organizations and others to combat hate speech and disinformation through non-restrictive measures, sort of using free speech and access to information to fight back against some of the dark sides. Yeah, so those are some of the projects that we're working on, and then maybe I'll have to see. Writing a book on the future of free speech
Yeah,
would be the natural progression, right, from
that's true.
history
That's
of
a
free speech.
logical, yeah,
Yeah,
logical addition. Yeah. Cool. Well, I mean, it sounds like you're going to be busy for a while because I feel like the free speech issues are not going away anytime soon. So,
I don't think so. I think free speech is never completely won or lost, and it'll be sort of
yep.
eternal struggle. And hopefully, I can contribute with my little um, piece of work. But and part of that is convincing other people that it's a worthwhile struggle.
Definitely. And what's the best way for people then to follow you and keep track of your work?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter. So that's at J Mchangama, JMCHANGAMA. I'm also on the boomer platform that is Facebook, um, and LinkedIn and so on. Then go to our futurefreespeech.com to follow our work, our social media outlets, and read some of our reports. You can see all the op-eds and interviews and so on there, and feel free to reach out if you're interested in what we do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your knowledge and for all the work you do on such a critical value for people. So
Thanks, Ben. It was an absolute pleasure.